Okay, thank you, Kia. Um, well, unaccustomed as I am to making Zoominars, as I call them, I did my first one last week, and that was kind of interesting experience, just speaking to a screen and nobody else. So forgive me if there's nobody, if I'm not looking at your eyes to see if anybody's awake or paying attention. So thank you to Chambers Ireland for facilitating this. Um, I thought the title is probably apt. We are in a new, surreal and unknown world when it comes to governance or indeed anything. I think my initial reaction when this struck was one of self-preservation. And the first thing I thought about, apart from the health and well-being of my family, was cash, both personal and business. And that was kind of phoning up the gym and saying, look, I don't want to pay for the next 3 months. I think I was their first phone call. And then phoning up the various banks and saying, I'm not paying my loans back for the next little while, albeit they're small, and so on. But anyway, I got quite a good reception everywhere I went. I think if you look back in time in terms of what's happened, certainly in my lifetime, we've had recessions, we had the dot-com bust, with the financial crisis, and now we have the pandemic. And certainly with the pandemic, there's no clear roadmap out of it. And most organizations or governments are trying to do their best and literally make it up as they go along with, scientific input. So, Kia. Great, thank you. So my name is David Duffy, as I was introduced by. The governance company, our business is carrying out board evaluations. We did one for Chambers Ireland there a couple of years ago, and basically helping organizations with getting their governance right, generally in regulated sectors like charities. I have some empathy with the group here today. I was on the board of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce for 6 years and was actively involved in their tax and transportation side. And I've been on a lot of boards, both commercial and non-profits. So I have a lot of scar tissue because I learned from every one of them. So that's kind of what we do. And I suppose this, next slide, please. Kia. Thank you. This presentation is prompted by a survey we did about 2 months ago. And I was wondering about how organizations were dealing with their governance when they couldn't meet. So we carried out a survey on what people knew about virtual board meetings and how they got organized. And that's going to be part and parcel of what I'm going to talk about over the next little while. We got 140 responses from about 10 countries, from chairs, CEOs, directors, company secretaries, and the lot. So a good spread. And my own background in governance is I've written these 2 books here, which are based on my own personal experience. I've been in governance stuff about 14 years, and I suppose I'm the leading and only author in the country who produces books, and they're kindly published by my institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants. So a lot of blood, sweat, and tears have gone into these. So next page. So what I want to talk about is board leadership and how it has looked to you over the last 8 weeks. I mean, it's been a very demanding time for board members and CEOs and anybody else who's had to kind of manage people. I want to talk about money, virtual board meetings, which will be the bulk of this presentation, and areas where directors might want to focus on in the future. And any questions you might have, and happy to address those via Kia and your emails. I'm sure there'll be lots. So board leadership. Next slide. So the words that I have here, like panicked and denial. So we go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, these are some of the things that I've heard over the last 8 weeks. Some boards panicked, some were quite resilient, some had great leadership, some were quite united, some were in denial, some were measured, and some just didn't know what to do. And that's not a great place to be in. And I suppose, if you look at how some of the governments around the world have addressed the virus, the same kind of spectrum applies to those who've handled well, like our own country, and others who haven't handled it at all well, without mentioning any names. So I think how your organization has responded will say a lot about your organization and the DNA of the board and the people on the board and the values of those people on the board and how they work together. We'll come back a little bit later in the presentation as to some of the hard questions that will need to be asked about the board. An example would be Dieselgate. If you remember that, the emissions scandal in the US that Volkswagen had. And, Volkswagen back in Frankfurt, I think they are, had no crisis management plan to deal with this. And they kind of faffed around the place for 3 or 4 days before they even got a press release out to say what they were going to do. And that's not where anybody wants to be. And it's the same in this whole situation. Is there's a crisis, what do you do? Well, you need to know of some sort of plan. And ironically, I've been writing quite a lot of business continuity plans retrospectively for the last 2 months for organizations that didn't have them, that should have had them. Next slide. So we asked the respondents, what are the top things that concern them over the last 2 months in the coronavirus? The top one was staff welfare, their health, their safety, their mental health in particular, and also how easy it was for them to work from home. For some it's easy, for some it's much more difficult depending on family circumstances. Uncertainty was number 2, which is no surprise. And 3 was kind of finance, funding, and where's the money going to come from in the future. And 4 was sales. So did they have a business that was broken or else it thrived in this environment or what? So uncertainty, morale, that's a key issue for any organization, and in particular from the chair. And I've heard quite a lot of organizations, I won't say the sector, but where the chair or the board have been too disconnected from the CEO in helping him or her do their job. So it's bad enough to be in isolation once from the coronavirus, but if you're isolated from your board, it's much more difficult. And it's really up to the chair to make sure that there's continuity of communication and support without being too close. You don't need to be best pals, but it's a lonely position trying to run an organization from your kitchen table, as most of us probably are today. The other thing that needs continuity is governance. Governance should not go out the window, and I don't think it has. But there's need to focus on virtual board meetings and getting them to work properly. And I think what a lot of organizations have been trying to do is to kind of ape the physical board meetings with virtual board meetings. And I actually think the virtual board meeting will be a different animal down the road and how that might look and feel. In terms of communications with staff, I think as our government has been, I think they've had good data, they've been honest, they've been forthright, and they've been telling people as it is. And I think CEOs and chairs and directors need to be the same and need to engage and understand how people feel within the organization. It's hard to know, even on a one-to-one Zoom call with somebody, how somebody actually feels about what's going on, because all you see is that person. You don't know what's going on around them. And it's very hard to understand, not being face-to-face, how they're coping. And that's important too. So we've heard of Zoom. I'd never heard of Zoom in December. I also found out that they've only 10 people employed, but yet they turned over something like 250 million in the last quarter. And of course, even doing something like this today, I wouldn't have dreamt of doing this 12 months ago, but it needs new skills. So we need lots of Kias of the world to make sure that these things can happen. And that is a strong skill set. Next page. Next page again. So in terms of financial matters, and I don't know, but I mean, I've come across various organizations where the financial reporting systems have not been timely, have not been accurate, and they weren't set up to be accessed remotely. So, if you're running organizations or part of organizations, it's absolutely fundamental that your systems enable you to keep going as if nothing had happened. So you're getting your management accounts monthly, via the CEO to the board, to the finance committee, whatever it might be. Other things that you might be looking at now is what's your cost model going forward and what would you change? There's a huge focus on cash management. A lot of organizations have what's called reserves policy to make sure they have enough money in the bank to wind the organization up if they need to do without going into an involuntary liquidation. So liquidity and cash collection have taken on a new meaning. And for those who are employed by the chambers, I would imagine you got most of your membership subs in, hopefully, before the crash came. But it also, I think, makes one think about actually what should be your cash collection model going forward. And that's something you need to think about. One other thing that I've come across is financial skills around the boardroom table. So a lot of organizations, could well be down the road where they don't have cash. They might be facing going concern issues. They might have people around the table to figure out, okay, what do we need to do to figure out if we are a going concern? What work do we need to do? What data do we need to do? What do we need to put in the minutes of a meeting to demonstrate that if it all goes belly up, we did do the right thing and we're not open to challenge by the shareholders. So that's important too. And the other thing that you probably all come across, of course, is that there's no allowance in Irish company law to have virtual board meetings. The Canadians changed this law overnight a little while ago, as I understand. And that's a sensible thing to do, and I'm sure we're doing that ourselves. So I suppose the message here is, you'll have all learned a lot from this pandemic. I certainly have. It's accelerated my business, and I'll tell you more about that later. But it's given us space to think about the new world that's out there. So as somebody once said, never let a good pandemic go to waste, and I'm sure you won't. Okay, next slide. So here's his other thoughts. Down the road, you'll know now if you're in hospitality, whatever, demand for your product sunk to zero. But if you look out, 3, 6 months, 9 months, will that demand come back? And if not, what do you need to do about it? Or do you need new products? And how is your business model going to look as online and offline? If you look at the big dinosaurs on the British High Street, like Marks and Spencers and Debenhams and a few others, they don't have an online presence, and that's affected Debenhams, I believe, and has affected Marks and Spencers on the clothes side. That they have online on the food side. But that's the way of the future. And your cost base. So we're all talking about, well, we don't need to move back into offices again, but if you want to put people back in office again, everybody's going to have twice the amount of space than would currently be the norm, which is about 10 square meters per head in an office. Access to finance. I was gobsmacked about 6 weeks ago when Bank of Ireland phoned me. It's the first time a bank has phoned me in 10 years to offer me finance, either loan or overdraft. And my needs are modest, so I said yes to both. And just to have that in the back pocket, just in case. But it's always been underwritten by the government of Brussels. Otherwise, they wouldn't be lending the money. The other things you need to consider are, do you have the right skills, systems, policies, procedures around the table? So, say in a business continuity situation, managing the workforce from home, whether it's 10 people or 100, it does need new policies and procedures. And you probably had to develop those as you went. But certainly, if you're going to have a mixture of people who work from home and from the office, that will need different policies and procedures just to make sure that, for instance, when do people start working in the morning, or are you flexible about when they work, providing they put in their 7.5 hours a day or whatever. Cash management I've spoken about, and certainly my mantra now with any new business I'm doing is to get more cash up front, because that's the name of the game at the moment. Okay, new slide. So virtual board meetings, which is the reason that this presentation is put together. So next slide. So the survey will come out in due course. We're still working on it and fine tuning it. And my colleague Ria, who's on the seminar here, has been instrumental in putting the whole thing together with great panache and great design. So there's a lot of good data in it, but one of the key pieces of data is this one here, that 50% of respondents do not take virtual board meetings as seriously as face-to-face ones, which is kind of worrying. And they're just as important. A director still has the same duties and responsibilities. But of course, it's much more difficult to engage people online. and what do you need to do that? People miss the face-to-face interaction. They miss the cup of coffee before and afterwards. And of course, you know, you need kind of different ground rules for online board meetings. I mean, I think the meetings are great because I don't have to get into a car, I don't have to wait somebody's reception, I don't have to wait for you there, because most people who join Zoom calls are on time, which is a great discipline and an ethic to have. One of the big things we also saw was that challenging in a virtual environment is much more difficult because, you know, a Zoom call is not perfect. You know, the speech doesn't travel as quickly, depending on your broadband. The words might take a little bit longer, or people might fade in and out. So there's a need for kind of really good ground rules, which we're going to come to in a minute. Okay. So these are kind of our 12 golden rules for successful board meetings. And these will be in the document. And the first one was, which is kind of an obvious one, does your constitution facilitate virtual board meetings? And approximately 30% of the respondents said they didn't know, or they weren't sure. And that means, you know, if you have a board meeting and your constitution doesn't allow it and it's challenged, those decisions can be overturned. So that's a concern. I mentioned at AGMs, we can't do that either, certainly for the moment. So if you're a chair of a board or a chair of any meeting that's been held online, if it's a management meeting or staff meeting, I think it's really important in advance to establish some ground rules that make sense for that particular setting. So in terms of board meeting, you know, obviously you start on time, but also I think given it's on Zoom, people's attention span will be shorter. So I think board meeting will need to be snappier. And, you know, good organizations will go through, the agenda. They'll have timed the agenda to figure out how much time they need on each of the items. But more importantly, I think, establish a system for intervention. So just supposing I'm there, Kia is the chair of the meeting, and she has said something and I want to make an intervention. You can try intervening, maybe three others will do it at exactly the same point. So you need some system to do that. Maybe it's a thumbs up, maybe it's putting your hand up, but develop some sort of system for that so it's clear to the chair who wants to speak next. Maybe you're given a card or something like that, but figure that out. I think also, given the times we live in, I think it's important that if they're board members, and certainly in all the chambers, they're all volunteers, and many of you who are not on chamber boards may well be on other boards, whether you're paid or not, you're still on a board. But every participant will have their own unique set of circumstances. So you need to know that, you know, are they in the right place to be at board meetings? Yes, no, or maybe. And the chair could well end up being a counsellor as well, even if he or she doesn't want to. That's reality. You know, the technology that we're using it's fairly recent, as is Zoom. We're all still learning, but tested in advance. I'm doing a Zoom a WebEx presentation next Monday for a life assurance company headquartered in Rome. 3 or 4 of the directors are here and 3 or 4 are in Rome. So that would be interesting to see how all that works. Another key point is, if you are going to have online board meetings, make sure your members have access to good technology like broadband. So you're all over the country with probably mixed technology. And you have to figure out, well, if you want to use all your broadband using video and audio or just audio. And of course, it's much better to see people as opposed to not see people. I was on a call last week. There was a particular individual who was down in Wexford. His broadband kept on going and coming. It drove us all mad. And I think in retrospect, that person should have tried to drive somewhere where he got better reception. But it didn't happen. I've talked about keeping the agenda short and maybe have more board meetings. I don't know what the right length for board meeting is at the moment, but it's certainly not 3 hours on Zoom. I don't think, particularly if they're all volunteers. It might be an hour and a half or 2 hours, but 3 hours is probably pushing it. Thank you. I think it's a good thing if everybody can be on video, so everybody can see each other, as opposed to a mixture of both. From the chair perspective, if you're trying to chair a meeting where you've eye contact with 4 or 5 and 4 or 5 you don't, you have no idea to what extent the other board members are engaged or not, and whether they're having their breakfast or a cup of tea or whatever it might be. It's better if there's a level of engagement. And I think the real challenge here for a chair is maintaining that engagement. So for example, as a topic on our re-entry strategy for the business into the new world, and if there's no questions after the topic, go around the table and ask people, because you are going to have people who are happy to say nothing, and you are going to have people who will say all sorts of stuff, but go around the table and ask. So if you find people whose eyes are kind of been thrown up to heaven a few times on screen, but then realize you've got a problem, so you need to figure out how you might deal with that. But the real challenge of the chair here is not just chairing the meeting, but keeping engagement as well. One thing that we learned from the survey was that there was very little opportunity for board members to provide feedback, either anonymously or otherwise, to the chair or the company secretary, to figure out how to run the meetings better. And it can be any aspect of them. And these will be the little things that will be defining in terms of running good board meetings, or indeed executive meetings. Figure out a facility to do that. And if people don't want to give the feedback directly, go to a trusted board member or the company secretary who has the credibility to do all of that. So make that anonymous. And also recognize that we're all human when it comes to board meetings. One might need a little break halfway through. So make sure that's timed into the agenda, which typically it is into board meetings. So there are some ideas on board meetings. And of course, the big effort now is, if you're remote from your office, assembling data, getting it out and all the rest of it, it can be much more difficult if your systems aren't up to scratch, like your financial systems, and what other way you might get like data to your board. So don't underestimate that. And also don't underestimate the importance of the financial information in a situation where, your organization may be struggling, trying to get sales in the door. It may have no sales in the door, or how does it get sales in the door? So make sure that the board is aware monthly, if not more often, what the financial status of the organization is. And that's a call for the chair and the board to ask the executive, look, we need fortnightly information. We want fortnightly cash information to see how we're doing, and see where that puts us going forward. So, areas of focus going forward. We are in a pandemic, but it will pass, I hope. So my great mantra is look at the sea and not the waves. So the pandemic are the waves at the moment, and they're enormous waves, and we've never seen waves these high before. Even in Rossnowla, these are huge waves. So look at the sea and not the waves. So good organizations, and I'm sure there's lots of great people listening to this, Zoominar, as I call it, is try and see through the crisis. And we're probably all a bit calmer than we were 6 to 8 weeks ago. I can certainly see a way forward here, which I didn't see some time ago. But this was a wake-up call to look at one's business going forward. So the number of areas I want to look at here, just 5 areas. One is kick the tires on your current strategy. So in your lighter moments, or at weekends, or in the sun, which we've just been blessed with the last little while, what elements of your strategy have stood the test of time with the pandemic? That'll very much depend on your sector, so I'm not going to go into that. You'll see down here at the end, the most affected sectors obviously are tourism, sports, entertainment, fintech, retail, restaurants. So if you're in one of those, or even if you're dependent on one of those for a living, or a lot of your business comes from one of those, you're going to have to good look at, to what extent and when will these sectors come back, and will they benefit our own business? So what has worked with your strategy and what has not worked, and do you know what needs to change? And these are all tough questions for anybody going forward. And can you pivot your business, which is kind of a trendy word at the moment? So a pal of mine in Barcelona from business school, his family have a perfume business. They sell Paco Rabanne, these sort of things. they converted their 5 factories to making sanitizer for the last 2 months because nobody was buying Packer Rabanne in chemists or stores because they weren't open. And that kept all those factories open and helped the Spanish. The other question would be, how much time have you got, to get this right? There's reality about how much cash we have in the bank, or what access to finance you have, or, worst case scenario, you can't see a future and you've got to reinvent and go back to basics. And believe me, I've done that a number of times in my life. And the other question might be is, okay, we all have competition. Are there smarter guys and girls out there than you that will see a way forward quicker than you will? So I wouldn't be sitting back and waiting for the pandemic to be over, because we don't know when it's going to be. That's what we do with our business over the next 3, 6, 9 months. And I remember back in the .com era, I was in the strategy consulting business for an awful long time. And we were doing then, because that world was moving so quickly, we were doing kind of strategy in a weekend for organizations, because they knew the world was going to be very different and unpredictable in 6 months' time. So they were kind of in the moment all the time and dealing with what they could see as opposed to what they could not see. You can see some examples here of some of the brands that are under pressure, like JCPenney in the US. That was my J1 visa. That was a massive store. They sold petrol there 35 years ago, which M&S did about 15 years ago. And you look at the universities, we're only kind of at the universities that deliver all their courses face-to-face. They have a huge challenge trying to replace the 20% of students that come from overseas, say in the UK. The next area is on governance, and are your governance structures fit for purpose? So I alluded in the beginning, do you have the right leadership? Do you have the right DNA and the right people around the table? And there may be the right people around the table, but they say, look, we need to have a discussion about where our organization is going. And we need to understand from people around the table, can they commit to going forward? Because they may well have their own problems, and you can bet your bottom dollar a good few will, because they have family issues or their business issues or both as a result of coronavirus. So I think it'd be a good thing to do quite soon for boards, particularly voluntary ones, to sit around the table and say, okay, is our business fit for purpose? Is our governance fit for purpose? And what do we need to do about it? And do we have the right leadership? And certainly this is a massive test of leadership for anybody. There's no cookbook for this. So I'd imagine that there's plenty of chairs now or CEOs are seeing the inside themselves they probably haven't seen before. And we're kind of in this world at the moment, but we need to move to what I call a new real world, whatever that might be. And that's hard to know. But part and parcel of the leadership amongst you here is actually to begin to shape that world, because if you don't, somebody else will shape it for you. So my mantra here is shape or be shaped in whatever business you're in. So don't hold back waiting for somebody else to sort of take with the baton and do something. You do it. In the business school I was in, we used to be a professor from McKinsey. He was a great guy, and I learned a lot in business school, but I've forgotten most of it. But one thing he said is, as a leader, you either lead, you follow, or you just get out of the way. So I think we're probably in that time now for people out there who want to lead. And of course, leading is difficult in these times because you're leading in massive uncertainty. Okay. So the next bit here is obviously when your strategy, you're going to be influenced by your strength of your balance sheet, your assets, physical, cash, investments, and all the rest of it, and access to financing. That's going to be a massive part of what you can do. And also your business model change and the financial implications of that, and getting the right information. So, standing back and looking at your business will be important, and to see what can be done. And there's lots of help out there from the government, which I've been a beneficiary of in a modest way, to try and help business get up and running. So, knock on doors. You never know what might be there. Okay, next slide. Leadership, we've talked a bit about that at board level. And I suppose if you are kicking the tires on your strategy? You kick the tires on your board, and do you have the right leadership to bring your organization where it needs to get to? And those are tough discussions to have. I've come across CEOs and chairs who are grand for one set of circumstances, but in others that just it's not for them, and that it can be difficult. So succession planning and what skills need for the future. Digital, no surprise. Managing remotely, and having the empathy to do that, what I call hard skills. I mean, the financial stuff is, we can get that, the legal stuff, wherever it might be, but the softer skills to be able to manage through Zoom or via mobile phone, they're much more difficult. And I think the challenge for any leadership now is being connected to the board, being connected to their staff, but being connected to the customers, whoever's paying the checks, to make the world go around is very important. And being in the moment. And what I mean by there is actually understanding what's going on outside the front door of your house, of your office, or wherever you're operating. Just be in the moment and just understand what's going on. And you can do that by just keeping in contact with people. I got a call yesterday from a client. I should have been calling him, saying, how are you getting on? He obviously called me or something, but he was just phoning people he hadn't been in contact for a while, just to sort of, I suppose, smell the roses, if you can call it that at the moment, but what's going on in the world. So lastly here, or second lastly, is organizational risk. So, no matter where you go in the future, you might have to go on a strategy that's more risky because you're going down a road that you haven't gone down before. And that's both organizational risk and personal risk. And personal risk can come back to personal guarantees and all that type of stuff. But have a very clear idea of what risk an organization is willing to consider going down the road. And that will be fundamental to what your ambition might be. So if you're kind of low risk as an organization, your appetite for doing anything out of the ordinary could be low, and it might be the end of the organization, or the world might overtake you because you're not operating fast enough. So risk is another big thing I'd be considering. So that's the formal end of the presentation, bar one more slide. So I was telling you about our own business. We had just launched a diploma in corporate governance last February. It was face-to-face. Not a great time to launch it. And we've decided face-to-face is no longer the way forward in online education for aspiring corporate governance professionals. So we've spent the last 8 weeks developing an online course, which will be accredited by UK University, which will be available not in August here, as it says, but in probably October. And that was kind of us just taking a view on the future of our business, what we need to do, because if you want to do face-to-face, you've got to travel somewhere. In some cases, you've got hotel expenses. You'll miss the networking, but we are going to have a networking kind of capability around this as well. So that's what we're doing as a business going forward. So I think that's it. Questions?